Okay, folks, what do we think, Rachel? Will it kick off? Yeah, okay. So firstly, I want to say hello and welcome once again to today's webinar on climate change as a feminist issue. We're absolutely delighted to be running this as a joint event from the COVID Conversations team, the Feminist Recovery Plan, and also Friends of the Earth. It marks the final webinar for both the COVID Conversations and also the Feminist Recovery Plan series. So thank you all for being with us for this past year. However, if it's your first webinar, or if you missed some of the previous ones, you can watch back all the Feminist Recovery Plan videos on the WRDA website. I'll drop a link for that into the chat in a minute. And also the launch of all the COVID Conversations videos will take place on the 29th of April. We'll have a special event for that. I'll also drop the link for that. So my name is Helen Flynn and I work at the Human Rights Consortium. I want to just quickly run over a few bits of housekeeping. Firstly, I think we can all agree it's difficult to focus too long on a webinar, so we aim to finish this one by 11. We're going to hear from each of our three speakers in turn for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions and conversation for the last maybe 15 minutes or so. You can put any questions or comments you have into the text box at any stage throughout the morning. Just remember to be respectful at all times. So we would ask anyone who isn't speaking to keep their microphones on mute and their cameras off. This not only cuts down on interference, but it also helps to reduce bandwidth, which we know is an issue for a lot of people in Northern Ireland, myself included. We'll be recording today's webinar with a view to upload it online. So unless you turn on your video and speak, you will not appear in that recording. We'll be sending out some resources and a survey after the webinar, and we would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill in that survey. It just really helps us to ensure that the events that we are delivering are actually the events that people want to see. So I think I speak for both the Women's Policy Group and the Human Rights Consortium when I say that the climate emergency is something that we have long been conscious of in terms of the impact both on feminism and also on human rights. But it's also something that we haven't fully engaged on. So we're hoping that activities such as this event today will mark the start of new ways of working together towards the same goal of a better, fairer Northern Ireland for everyone. Like me, you're probably all keen to hear from our speakers, so I'm going to wrap it up there and introduce our first speaker, who is Rachel Powell. Rachel is the women's sector lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and she's also the chair of the Women's Policy Group in Northern Ireland. Rachel works to inform and influence the development and implementation of policy in Northern Ireland to ensure the impact on women has been incorporated. The Women's Policy Group published the COVID-19 Feminist Recovery Plan in July 2020. And within this, they made various recommendations to mitigate against the gendered impact of the pandemic alongside pre-existing inequalities. This has included recommendations for care to be put at the core of our economy and to be included in any developments to tackle the climate crisis. So Rachel, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So this, as Helen said, is the last in our webinar series from the Feminist Recovery Plan, and we've had over 500 people attend these sessions to date, so it has been absolutely wonderful. But as Helen said, my name is Rachel Powell and I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist, and I also coordinate the work of the Women's Policy Group. And I know there are several Women's Policy Group members on this call today, so I'll try and keep this overview brief before we move on to our expert speakers. So before we begin, I want to give a very brief overview about the Feminist Recovery Plan and how this series came about. So for many of you, you already know that the Women's Policy Group is a group of women working on policy roles across Northern Ireland. And we have members from across the women's sector, LGBT sector, trade unions, human rights organisations, migrant rights groups, campaigning feminist and advocacy roles that attend each meeting and work collaboratively together. We do a wide range of policy work through responding to consultations, submitting evidence, publishing briefings and the works. But once COVID hit, we were really faced with our biggest challenge to date. Immediately, we were deeply concerned about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women globally. And we spent a significant amount of time at the beginning of the first lockdown last year, calling on our elected representatives to mitigate against the impact on women. This involved creating briefings, articles, publishing statements, submitting evidence to both NI executive ministers and committees, and also the Westminster Women and Equalities Committee. But as the months went on and we were continuing to respond to the pandemic, there was very little reference or acknowledgement at all of the disproportionate impact that the pandemic was having on women from our elected representatives. Even when groups were being set up by our government to respond to the pandemic, we were constantly being left out and had to repeatedly ask to be allowed in the room to have a say about how to handle the crisis. So, for example, with economic recovery groups being set up, we were told this isn't an issue for the women's sector. And even groups where it was a voluntary and community sector meeting, we had to ask to be a part of this as we were left out. And to us, that was very reflective of how attitudes were in our government in terms of recognizing the impact on women. It was just seen as a separate issue. So we do know that the ongoing pandemic has created a truly unprecedented challenge across the world. But for us, the main thing is that it put a very sharp focus on the value and importance of care work, both paid and unpaid, and highlighted the essential nature of often precarious and almost always low paid retail work. Women undertake the majority of this work and will bear and continue to bear a particular brunt of this crisis, economically, socially, and in terms of health. And we also know that women across the world have been very much not included in the response throughout different governments. So the Women's Policy Group called on decision makers across the UK to ensure a gender sensitive crisis response was taken as we transitioned from crisis response to recovery. And 1 year on, there still has been very little development on that from our executive in recognising the impact on women. And just a number of weeks ago, an economic recovery plan was released that doesn't mention women outside of the context of STEM or apprenticeships and doesn't even mention childcare. So to us, we just thought the pandemic is one crisis that we are truly facing, but the climate crisis is also going on and we can't forget about this. And one of the solutions we feel is that in creating any Green New Deal, we should be putting care at the core of this as a low emission and efficient sector, which could also have huge benefits for gender equality. So the Feminist Recovery Plan is quite detailed and covers a wide range of issues, but we will be sending it out to everyone afterwards. But today I want to talk about a climate justice briefing that we have done on this, and we'll send this out to everyone as well. So I'm going to share the screen really briefly just so you can see the briefing. And I'll go through some of our recommendations within this, but basically this is our climate justice briefing. And it summarises everything that we've said in relation to the climate crisis throughout the Feminist Recovery Plan. Oh, let's see if it would let me go down. Yeah, so basically, I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want to give you a bit of an idea of some of the issues that we have covered. But we were trying to we basically wanted to start this conversation in Northern Ireland, where our feminist movement and women's sector is incredibly active on a whole range of issues. But we also know the climate crisis is one of the biggest issues facing our generation. And to us, we really thought that these issues needed to be merged together, and that any development that is happening in Northern Ireland in tackling the climate crisis, that gender equality was also incorporated into this. So I'm just going to stop sharing. I'll send that out to everyone afterwards. But basically, Northern Ireland remains the only part of the UK or Ireland without a binding greenhouse gas reduction targets, and this needs to change urgently. It is absolutely crucial that any targets set in the Northern Ireland Climate Change Bill are based on the most up-to-date scientific evidence available rather than political opinion. The lockdown exposed the severe impact of governmental decisions to neglect our public services on our society, and many of the existing socioeconomic inequalities were exacerbated during the lockdown, as a lack of resilience or ability to cope with the ramifications of the pandemic became glaringly obvious. The need for basic levels of income, access to food, childcare, fully functioning health service, education, changing considerations of low-skilled work to essential work, and recognising the importance of unpaid care became absolutely crucial and very topical in the last few months. And now more than ever, it is necessary to reassess our economic decisions and our decision making based on the recent history of severely under-resourced public goods. So as we move out and ease the lockdowns, we really want for decisions on the economy to be focused on creating a Green New Deal that tackles the climate crisis, but one that incorporates gender equality at the core. So the Women's Policy Group then in the Feminist Recovery Plan endorsed the joint UK Women's Budget Group and the Women's Environmental Network paper from the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, and it is called Towards a Feminist Green New Deal in the UK. So this paper discusses how whenever there are discussions around Green New Deal frameworks, typically gender, race and class are left out of the discussion, despite these being the areas where people are most likely to be impacted if the climate crisis is not made a priority. So this paper also looks at the Green New Deal from an intersectional feminist perspective, and this is an approach that the Women's Policy Group would very much like to see the Northern Ireland Executive take in relation to our economic recovery and any developments made in tackling climate change. So to us, we see the climate justice as a feminist issue based on the intersectional impact that it has. And just some of the key stats that really put this to the forefront is the fact that 85% of care jobs are done by women, yet only 32% of MPs are women, and they're the ones making the decisions in relation to the Green New Deal. But 80% of people displaced globally due to climate change are also women. We argue as well that paid and unpaid work are an integral part of the transition to a green economy and are, for the most part, already a low emission sector. The systemic lack of recognition and investment in social infrastructure has created industries which, in small amounts of investment care, can create significant returns in both employment opportunities and service improvement. And from a feminist perspective, it is absolutely essential to balance the emphasis on decarbonising the economy with the stated commitment to redressing social injustice. They're inherently connected and can't be separated. This requires both awareness of and strategies for changing gender norms and stereotypes. And central to feminist ecological economics is the normative claim that gender equality should not be achieved at the expense of ecological degradation or the exploitation of nature and other species, and that environmental sustainability must not be achieved by exploiting feminized labour. So we make a lot of different recommendations in relation to care work being a key sustainable industry, but I just want to finish up with some stats from the Women's Budget Group on why we feel this is a feminist issue that should be at the forefront of our economic decision making. So Women's Budget Group research indicates that a 2% GDP investment in care, which includes social care, childcare, parental leave and so on, creates double the amount of jobs for women and almost as many jobs for men than the same investment in construction. The investment in free universal childcare especially returns almost all of its initial investment. The care industry is 30% less pollutant in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than the construction industry, and the education industry is 62% less pollutant than the construction industry. To us, this is particularly important because when conversations arise around renewable technologies and efficient construction, these tend to be sectors where it's male-dominated work. And we really want to challenge that, challenge gender segregation, but also challenge the idea of what we need to do in terms of tackling climate change and how care can really be at the forefront of that. So throughout our briefing, which I will send out, we have a number of recommendations on a feminist Green New Deal for Northern Ireland and how it relates to the executive commitments from New Decade, New Approach. We also have a bit around how we need to be focusing on the investment in social infrastructure, green jobs, sharing care, democracy and ownership, and also international responsibilities. We go into a lot more detail within the briefing, which I will send out to everyone afterwards, but that just gives a bit of an overview to how we've started this conversation on the connection between the climate crisis and feminism in Northern Ireland. And now I'm going to hand it back over to our chair, who's going to introduce our expert speakers who are working in this field and can give us all a lot more information and hopefully get us all thinking about how we can incorporate this into our own activism and work.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. That's, I think, a really great overview of what the Feminist Recovery Plan is doing. And also, I think we're all really looking forward to receiving the recovery plan and also that briefing document. A really great move at like setting out your stall, and also like that really keenness to have an intersectional approach to this, I think is so important. So thank you so much for that overview. And I am now going to introduce our second speaker, who is Vicenza Sarifas. Vicenza is an ecofeminist researcher and activist from Mourne who explores environmental justice through a feminist lens. She's previously worked with Young Friends of the Earth Europe, Plan International, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and with environmental and social justice organisations in both Cyprus and Greece. Currently, Vincenza is doing a PhD exploring resistance to extractivism in the Sperrins through a feminist perspective. So I am so delighted to welcome Vincenza today. So Vincenza, if you want to take the floor.
Thanks so much, Helen, and thanks for the invite to be here. It's really great to be part of this conversation. And thanks to Rachel as well for really introducing the topic so well, and for all of the work that's been done already on this in Northern Ireland, which is really great to see. So I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about this link between gender and climate change. And I'm sure everybody here has, heard that women are often first and worst affected by climate change. But it's already been mentioned, that it's so important that we take an intersectional approach to this, because women aren't just a unified group, right? Their lives are mediated by different identities like age and class and ethnicity and race and lots of different other factors as well. But it really has become so clear that it's the communities that are facing, the brunt of the climate crisis, are also kind of at the front line of the COVID crisis that we're facing. And we see that, with women doing so much of the vital care work to see us through the pandemic. But we also see how, migrant women and ethnic minority women as well have been on the front lines and have been impacted disproportionately as well. And, I think that when we say women are most impacted by climate change, it's really important to mention that this is not because of some kind of like essentialist link or some kind of biological vulnerability, but it's because of the like structural inequalities in the system that we live in, the capitalist patriarchy. And we know that women are more likely to live in poverty, are paid less, and are doing this care work, often unpaid, which puts them into a closer contact and relationship with the environment. But to kind of understand how deep this connection goes between gender justice and climate justice, I think we have to kind of go back in time really to sort of the emergence of the climate crisis. And I think we have to go all the way back to this transition to the capitalist system that we have today. And that was kind of like also wrapped up in the scientific revolution and then the industrial revolution, which kind of led us to become this kind of fossil fuel dependent society that we're part of today. And it was, during this time that we see a new worldview come in. And I think that, this kind of shows how deep this connection is. And it was during this time that we see the environment sort of be understood, moving from seeing as a living being to being seen just as a resource or, a dead commodity that we can extract profit from. So, we have a system that depends on creating the other. So the other was, the environment was created as the other, but this is also happening to other groups of people, based on class and gender and race. And other factors. And if you become the other, it's much more easy for you to become, to be exploited or dehumanized or marginalized or violence enacted against you. And then we saw, that this worldview really was exported around the world with colonialism. And ecofeminists have pointed out that, that this is the worldview that our current crises are rooted in. And I really love the work of feminist Silvia Federici. And she talks about how during this time, it wasn't just a change in how we see the natural world, but also gender roles were changed very much in this time. And, we saw the crackdown on women's freedom, and we saw 300 years of the witch hunts, which she relates to this idea of disciplining women through gendered violence and terror to push them into a situation where they were doing most of the unpaid care work to prop up the capitalist system. And she also talks about how it was a time of, breaking down female solidarity as well and friendship. And she points to, this term of gossip, which before this transition used to refer to female friendship, but then became very kind of negative and gendered term as well. And she also mentions as well how this was the time of the crackdown on reproductive justice, where we see, a crackdown on abortion rights. And she says that this is really because women's bodies needed to be treated as commodities to reproduce the labor for capitalism. So in that way, I see, reproductive justice as a really important part of climate justice as well. And it's not just, about giving birth or having an abortion. It's about all of the ways that we should be able to choose and be able to look after the children we choose to have as well. So it, like, for me, it includes, housing rights and the right to a clean environment and economic and social well-being as well. But to kind of come back to this idea of care work, which is so central to this whole question, and this idea of social reproduction, which is all of these, life-sustaining activities that we need to survive. I think, yeah, they're so central to this system that we have, but it's a system that treats, women and nature as a free resource to extract from. And we know that the system itself is actually exhausting this very base that it depends on, and that's, the more than human world and the labor of women and marginalized groups. So yeah, ecofeminist economics really points out that the environment and women's labor is not actually accounted for under our current economic system. It's kind of externalized and made invisible. And related to this very much is this whole idea of extractivism. And I think Linda's going to talk much more about that. So I'm not going to say too much on that, but it really is, more than just about removing resources from the earth. It's very much rooted in this worldview that I mentioned before there. And, it's about having people that don't matter and places that don't matter that can be sacrificed. And we see around the world that it's women, and especially women of color and Indigenous women and peasant and rural women, who are impacted first and worst by this type of development. But this has all been a wee bit negative, but it's also important to say that women are not just victims of this, but have huge amounts of agency. And around the world, we're seeing amazing stories of women standing up to climate change and extractivism, and in many cases seeing it kind of as an extension of care work for caring for the environment, and that sustains life. And I know Linda will talk more about specific examples of that as well. But I just wanted to mention a project that I was really lucky to be involved with as a researcher, called the Women Speak database with the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. And that's a database full of thousands of stories from around the world of women who are doing this work and providing solutions as well. And I think it's really important that we understand that in, again, not in some essentialist way by saying women are like naturally more caring of the environment, but it's because of this gender division of labor, that women are experiencing the material impacts of this, of all of these issues. For example, like women might be the first to see their water being polluted or their children getting sick, because they're doing the care work. And I think it's important as well to say that about 60 to 80% of grassroots environmental justice organizing around the world is done by women. But again, as you move up through like institutional levels that are dealing with this, it's again dominated by Western men. So yeah, really missing out this gendered lens as you move up through these organizations. And as well, the women who are standing up and speaking out about this are also facing huge amounts of misogyny and violence. They're still operating in a patriarchal world, and we see female earth defenders being murdered and intimidated and threatened and sexually assaulted around the world as well. And I think connected to this as well, I'd like to talk a wee bit about this whole idea of like the misogyny of climate deniers. And I think, we've all seen young women like Greta Thunberg standing up and speaking out about this issue very, very clearly and very well. But again, you see this very much gendered language whenever we're talking about that. The women are described as being too loud, or there's a focus on her mental illness. And that's, a tactic that's been used throughout history to, call women too emotional or hysterical when they like stand up and speak out in the public world. And I think that this is really threatening to our current system, because it's challenging a whole sort of masculine worldview of a world that's available for conquer by like a very small elite group of men who might happen to be the CEOs of the corporations who are responsible for the, you know, the majority of the climate crisis. And this is really challenging that whole worldview. And yeah, I just wanted to say as well a few words about the whole building back better narratives as well. And I think Rachel's done a really good job of, yeah, going into that. So I won't say too much, but again, you know, I just want to emphasize that it's so important that this idea of care work or social reproduction is in that vision. You know, and it's, yeah, the areas that we really need to invest in and also to revalue as a society. I think there are areas that have been like feminized and devalued, which is really a shame, but they are, you know, the life sustaining activities that boost community well-being and again, you know, our low carbon jobs like we've heard. And yeah, again, you know, this Green New Deal narrative that very much focuses on construction or tech or energy jobs, which are mainly held by men, is really based in a kind of masculinist assumption about what the economy is for and who it's for. And just to give an example of that, when the UK Build Back Better campaign released images of, it was like a man in a hard hat carrying solar panels and a woman with looking after kids. This was challenged by feminists in the UK, but I think it kind of goes to that deeper question that we need to challenge gendered stereotypes and this division of labour. And then finally, I'd just like to touch on this idea of, you know, feminist solutions to the climate crisis. And, you know, I think feminists have been really powerful in saying, you know, that when solutions are purely scientific or technical or market-based, they don't consider social inequality. So, you know, they're really calling these out as false solutions. And to give an example of that, you know, if we look to geoengineering, you know, or this idea that we can suck the carbon from the air or dim the sun, you know, it first of all relies on technologies that don't even exist yet, but it doesn't address any inequality that is built into the system. And these solutions are very, you know, colonial and patriarchal still, because they're still rooted in that worldview that sees the environment as out there to be conquered and controlled and dominated. And, you know, this is the worldview that's got us into the crisis, so it won't get us out of it again. So feminists are saying, you know, we really need to challenge the current power structures that we have and also ways of thinking, you know, and it's about valuing different kind of knowledge systems, whether that's local knowledge or Indigenous knowledge or storytelling, and challenging who the expert is and who is being listened to. As well, I think that feminists have been really amazing on this topic in saying that, you know, we need systemic change. It's not just about individuals as well. So we can't just add women and stir to the situation. So for example, if we just had more female CEOs of a fossil fuel company or a mining corporation, but the company still continues to be structured around the need to like have constant growth and continues to cause human rights and environmental abuses around the world, you know, that's not a real solution. And, you know, as well, if we see climate change as this technical issue, you know, it might mean that we're just going to swap one energy system for another. But again, you know, that doesn't address the inequalities such as energy poverty, which are built into that system. And that has huge gendered elements to it. And, you know, we know that in Northern Ireland, we have some of the highest fuel poverty rates in Western Europe. And this disproportionately impacts on, you know, single parent households, which are overwhelmingly female headed as well. So we really need this sort of gendered lens to every single thing that we're talking about when it comes to climate change solutions. And then as well, you know, feminists have been really strong in pointing out that neoliberal approaches like that are based solely on individual like lifestyle changes aren't enough. They might be a first step and they are an important part of the story as well. But again, we need this systemic change at a much deeper level. So to give an example of that, you know, if we rely on consumer behavior change, like encouraging people to buy more organic or recycled, products. First of all, that's a class issue, but it doesn't address this who's doing the work inside households, and it could end up with women doing more unpaid work and having more responsibility as well. And yeah, and just to finish off, to say, in contrast to all of that, a feminist green recovery would take a really holistic approach to climate change, and I think that's being done by the work in Northern Ireland at the minute, which is really amazing to see. And putting social justice at the heart of it, and seeing housing rights and ending gender-based violence and healthcare and childcare and reproductive justice, all of these are part of the story as well, and we can't separate them out into different boxes. So I think I'll just end it there, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Vincenza. I could absolutely listen to you all day, and it's that rub with all of these events where it's like I really want to listen to the speakers forever, but at the same time we have an hour, so we're going to move swiftly on to Linda, but who is our final speaker. But thank you so much for that. There's so many points that you made in that where I had those aha moments, that you just clarified so many things that had been rattling around and that I'd been thinking about maybe, and I'd been reading about in the course of work, but you've just beautifully clarified that. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciated it. And I am also delighted to introduce our last speaker then, who is Linda Sullivan. Linda is a writer and a social and environmental justice activist. She previously worked for the Human Rights Consortium before traveling in Latin America, reporting on land and water rights struggles. Linda spent 5 years in Peru, accompanying the Andean communities in their resistance against mega extractive projects such as mining and mega dams. She is currently working on issues of climate justice and extractivism with Friends of the Earth, supporting communities in the Sperrins and across the island. So delighted to welcome our final speaker for today, Linda.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Vincenza. I feel like you've covered so much and so well that I could probably just leave it there, but I'll talk for a bit. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so all right, so the previous speakers outlined very clearly how the climate emergency is a feminist issue, and myself working in the environmental sector for the past 3 years here, admits fully that we need to learn more from the women's sector on how to fully incorporate gender justice into our calls for climate justice. So the inequality and exploitation of women, as Vincenza has outlined, has the same roots as the climate and ecological crisis and the exploitation of nature. So the roots of dualism, of capitalism, colonialism. And to take these interconnected exploitations and to tackle them, we must change the system that perpetuates them. So the climate crisis is a consequence of a system that needs to exploit and consume and pollute in order to survive. So like a parasite that we've been duped into feeding. So climate justice then, it goes much deeper than simply reducing the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And there's so many aspects to talk about, and Vincenza's covered a lot of them. But there are more, such as food sovereignty, how to free ourselves from the trap of industrial agriculture, reclaiming the commons, and the commons in terms of land and air and water, but also in terms of health and social care and education, public transport and energy. There's creating vibrant, sustainable, democratic local economies with worker-owned and controlled workplaces. So looking at the idea of community wealth building as an example of how this can be done, and there are efforts already ongoing here to make that a reality. There's also, of course, the move away from GDP as a measure of society's success and moving to a well-being economy. the need for degrowth in the global north, and a redistribution of wealth and resources to the global south. But yeah, I won't delve into all of those individually, so we'll be here all day, but I'll just concentrate on a few concrete examples of how like climate justice shows up here. So as Rachel said earlier, we're the only jurisdiction on these islands that doesn't have a single piece of climate legislation. A key ingredient in the new decade, new approach was the enactment of a Climate Change Act, along with a fair and just transition. Last year, the Assembly also then voted to bring forward this legislation within 3 months. And at the time, the Agriculture and Environment Minister, while refusing to consider the climate change as an emergency or a crisis, also said it was impossible to do that within this time frame. Well, it's only impossible until it's done. And exactly 3 months from that Assembly motion, civil society, legal experts, along with all the other major parties, excepting the Minister's party, presented a comprehensive bill to the Speaker's office as a private member's bill. So that bill finally had its first reading last week, and will now progress through the different stages of lawmaking. So the bill has embedded in it the principles of a just transition. So with fairness, equality, and the alleviation of poverty, a legal requirement in the plan to bring us to zero carbon by 2045. So, and as you can see by this great cartoon by the brilliant Ian Knox, Minister Poots then tried to claim back the agenda with his own consultation on plans to bring forward a bill, but his timing and content are too little, too late. So yeah, so another aspect that Vincenza mentioned that I'd like to talk a wee bit more about of climate justice is the issue of extractivism. So what is extractivism? First of all, it's the high intensity export orientated extraction of common ecological goods rooted in colonialism and the notion that humans are separate from and superior to the rest of the living world. So this definition is taken from this report that you can see. A justice transition is a post-extractive transition, which is a report by Warren Mont. And yesterday they released their next report, which is a material transition, which is also, of what I've seen so far, an excellent guide to how we tackle the issue of renewables in a climate justice framework. So yeah, so when many people talk about climate action, it's often thought of that we can just switch to renewables while still retaining the same level of extraction, consumption, and waste. But this approach just means like a mammoth increase in extraction of metals and minerals, and the continuing sacrificing of ecosystems and communities. So most of these communities are based in the global south, but increasingly sacrifice zones are being created in the global north. And the island of Ireland is one such place. So 27% of the land south of the border is already concessioned to mining companies, and 25% in the north is concessioned to mining companies. And this could rise to 70% according to the Department for the Economy. So I won't go into this because Jen's already covered it, but the gendered impacts of extraction. So just quickly run through. So inequality fosters by colonialism, negatives in the domestic sphere, such as water and air pollution. So this affects like care and agriculture, and then social breakdown that comes from extraction and extractive projects moving into communities. Like the bodily impacts from that contamination, such as birth defects, miscarriage, and ovarian cancer. In my time in Peru, there was a a town near to the mining project that they were resisting, and there was a mercury spill. And to this day, like 20 years later, people are still have that mercury in their blood, and babies are still being born with defects because of that. So yeah, and then also sexual violence and violence for transgressing accepted gender norms. So women take a huge risk, especially in places like Peru, for being part of the resistance movement, and often receive violence, both domestic and otherwise, as a result of this. Okay, so moving on then, as Vincenza was also saying, like we can't mine our way out of the climate crisis, but also like women are at the heart of the resistance against extractivism and for climate justice. So these are just some pictures of people from the Greencastle People's Office down the Sperrins. Many, as you can see there, Chaz Dewitt up in the corner from the Lakota Nation, who came to visit and show solidarity. We have Berta Cáceres' daughter in the middle. So like international solidarity is a really important ingredient in resistance against these projects, because it's the same system across the globe, you know, just the various different levels of violence, you know. But then also beyond resistance against extractivism, women are at the heart of environmental justice on the island. And particularly when you look at the youth strikers, they're overwhelmingly female and are leading the way in the calls for climate justice. So, and then an international example and just my own experience of Peru. I was involved in a group of women defenders of Mother Earth, and they were really often put themselves to the front of mobilizations, and so it's like led the way, both like, well, from below, like in a supportive sense, but also more increasingly and at huge risk, like up front. So yeah, I'll leave it there and maybe just move on to the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to switch my view to gallery view so I can see everybody. I haven't got any comments or questions in the chat box yet. Does anybody in the audience have any questions for, I'm just conscious we only have about 10 minutes. So does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Got a comment that was great, and I heartily agree. And thank you so much, Linda, for rounding out the presentations today. Eleanor.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment to say that's extraordinarily wonderfully inspiring. It's my last day of work. And as Martina said, from 5:01 last night, we were officially unemployed because none of us have heard about our wages yet, which we are confident, but we have not heard one word, because apparently the DFC can set a budget for neighbourhood renewal, but not for the Women's Centre Childcare Fund. Why would that be? So there's lots going on here. It's a really horrible time to close a centre without being able to offer the staff who have been on the front line. And, you know, we're always interested in climate change and doing it with the children. You know, we do stuff in after schools and story time, but we would love to do more. I'd love to be more of an eco warrior. That's our aim for this year. But it's just wonderful to hear things going on everywhere, because I nearly didn't come because of end of year banking and all. But I'm so glad I've taken the time to come. And thank you for organising it. And say it was really wonderful. I really enjoyed it. So I'm sorry I don't have a very deep question, but I'm very glad and I'm feeling inspired for April when we come back again, hopefully with wages. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for that, Eleanor. I'm just wondering as well, I'm getting a lot of really people saying it was great and fantastic event and great presentations, hadn't realised how far behind Northern Ireland was. I'm wondering if I can put you, the three of you, on the spot and ask therefore if there's scope for some work to be done together on looking at this issue, you know, and an action that we could take forward to work together on the environment, on feminism and on human rights, specifically in Northern Ireland, and whether we'd be up for having that conversation and seeing what kind of actions we could take.
Yeah, absolutely. I know from the Women's Policy Group perspective, this is something that we very much just started to scratch the surface on. When we were doing our Feminist Recovery Plan, we were looking at it and thinking, why are these areas where women are predominantly worked in always undervalued, always underfunded? And it really just was a bit of a light bulb moment, like, well, this is so connected to the same issues with the climate crisis. So I would love to work with the rest of the speakers more on delving a bit deeper into these issues and learning how we can, in our activism on gender justice, can be very much more conscious of climate justice, because I learned so much today already on this, and would love to take it forward. And especially now with the climate change bill and the different political aspects of that are going on, I think we all need to really get behind the private members bill, because I think the dear minister will be very happy for people to stay quiet on this. So I think that would be something all of us could be very much more active on together.
I see Annie wants to come in, so do you want to go ahead, Annie?
Thanks, Helen. And just to say again, I was, you know, what other people are saying, and blown away with the speeches. So thank you very much. It's so incredible to know we have such knowledge and expertise and passion in the women's sector and the eco sector. I just wanted to say, for anyone who maybe isn't aware of it, that you know, Extinction Rebellion Northern Ireland are here, and you'll all know about that. We have a regeneration and wellbeing group. We're primarily women, but it's open for everyone. And if anyone is interested in that, please do come and join us, or, you know, pop in, because we're trying also to make that interconnection between well-being in the deepest sense of the word for the planet and regenerative culture, and definitely embed it within all of that perspective around gender equality and the need for like serious, radical, fundamental, systemic, you know, change in the systems. We're not going back. So we would like very much to be part of that conversation and going forward. I've certainly felt a real kind of gap, you know, there's so many eco-feminists, so many brilliant feminists in the women's sector, but I don't think we've merged them together. And I think when we do, there'll be brilliant synergy, and, you know, that will become our tipping point. So just to say, we would like to be part of that. And if anyone is interested in that regeneration and wellbeing group, it's a lovely, easy group to be in. That we're not like the boys' clubs. Do, you know, pop into the Extinction Rebellion webpage and join us, because the meetings are all advertised there. So thanks again.
So much for that, Annie. And I'm sure Rachel is okay if you're going to be sending out a follow-up email, so Rachel could pass out the details of that grouping.
Yeah, definitely. If you could stick it in the chat, Annie, I can send it out in the email to all participants afterwards.
And I have a couple of questions here that I'm just going to combine, because, you know, I am conscious that we want to finish by 11. I have a question on, in terms of taking action, would you agree that act local, think global is very useful for individuals, but when thinking global, we need to consider the roots in global capitalism, which is something I think we have touched on, but maybe explore that a bit more deeply. And then another question, a much more practical one from Kieran, what happens next with the climate bill, especially now there's two competing ones, and can gender equality be a part of that? So could maybe each of the speakers give me a few thoughts on those two?
You want me to jump in first, Vincenza? Yeah, definitely act local, think global, but also, like, by acting locally, we're also acting globally, you know, so by creating like local democratic worker controlled economies, we're taking our power away from global capitalism. So, and food sovereignty the same, you know, we're taking our power away from the global industrial agriculture model. So yeah, definitely those are interconnected, you know. With regards to the climate bill, so as far as we're concerned, there is no two competing bills, because DAERA hasn't produced a bill. They've put out a consultation, and that's it, you know. There is a bill sitting with Stormont, and like, even at that, you know, it's a push to get it through in this mandate, because of the kind of different stages that it needs to go through to become law. So if DAERA hasn't even produced anything yet, it's you know, theirs isn't even in the picture, you know. So I think the effort needs to be in making sure that the private members bill gets through in time, and that no blocks are put before it, and that, you know, it's the best it can be coming out the other end.
Great, I'd maybe jump in there. Just to the first question, it's a really good question, and I think Galinda's covered it well. But yeah, just to say, I think that collective action and movement building is our strength here. That's where we're going to create change. And you know, that can be done at a local level by like carving out space from the system we live in and like being the alternative we want to see in the world. But we also need to do as well, you know, targeting like the real root of the crisis, which we know are these like big corporations, mostly, you know, like mining and fossil fuel corporations. And just to mention, I'm part of a campaign here in the north as well, a divestment campaign, because our local government pension funds are actually heavily invested in fossil fuel companies. And we know that it's just 100 fossil fuel companies are responsible for like 70% of emissions around the world. So it's really about tackling that power structure as well. So we're trying to get those pensions to stop investing in those companies. So yeah, I think, yeah, we have to be strategic and address the power structures as well. Thanks.
So I'm just going to respond really quickly because I've talked loads already, but the main thing for me about the Think Local, Act Global, it's something that we very much have tried to incorporate into our work in the Women's Policy Group, where we look at best practice globally and how can we implement a better structure here. And at the core of all of the campaigning we've been doing around the Feminist Recovery Plan is about restructuring our economy, because our economic models that currently exist do not account for unpaid care or the free labour of women. And I think we have a huge hurdle to cross here in Northern Ireland, where not only is there complete denial of the climate crisis by the minister responsible for it, our executive largely denies a lot of our gender inequality that exists. And doesn't see it as priority areas, but they're so inherently linked. They're so connected to capitalism and workers' rights and a whole range of other issues that I think it would be brilliant for us to put the pressure on in terms of this private members bill, to be lobbying our MLAs to make sure that it is being passed and that there are no blocks in place. We probably won't get all parties supporting it, because there'll be one who likely won't, but I think it would be really good if people are interested to try and work together and do some very targeted lobbying on this, because we're dealing with an assembly term where 5 years are being crammed into 2, and we're constantly being told that nothing, you know, time's running out to bring anything else in this mandate. But I think we are owed a lot more than that from our executive, and we shouldn't be letting these issues waste away until the next term after the elections. It's the same with the childcare strategy. It's the same with the racial equality strategy, the Irish Language Act. So many issues are just being, you know, kicked down the line. And I think if we very much put the pressure on, we can make a difference on this.
I just wanted to jump in as well. I was just a bit slow because I was looking up the ad hoc committee on a Bill of Rights recently did a consultation over the Christmas period into the new year, and the results of that survey were released last week. And I mean, we talk about some parties not being particularly on board, but 86% of respondents, there were over 2,000 respondents to that survey. Sorry, I should have prefaced it with them, but 86% agreed that a Bill of Rights should include the right to a healthy environment. And that was really positively consistent level of support across all demographics. So, you know, the kind of, I think some of the older arguments about certain people don't support these things is fading away, and there's a real potential to move on there. But just, we're about time to wrap up. I just want to say a huge thank you to all 3 of our speakers. It's for me been such an eye-opening event, and I've learned so much, and I'm really hoping that something good will come out of this, in that we can start working together more on this, because we're all doing, I think, really important work around these issues, but we just need to join that up, and, you know, there's power in numbers. So thank you all so much. I'm just going to pass over in case any of the speakers want to say anything to finish up.
Yeah, I was just very quickly going to say, so this event, we tried to make it where we're looking at global issues, but applying it to the Northern Ireland context. WRDA is also doing a follow-up event on the 22nd of April. So Deirdre, who's on the call, it's going to be in collaboration with Trócaire and looking at women who are at the front lines of defending human rights and the environment globally. So I've posted it in the link and we'll share it with everyone else too. And I'll also send all of these resources and also a survey that I'd really appreciate. It should take no more than 1 minute to respond to if people could fill out.
Yeah, I'll also send to Rachel so she can send out some of the reports that I mentioned. And yeah, I'm also excited about like seeing what can come from more working together. Because yeah, I think it's definitely yeah, just that. I've kind of run out of words. So
Yeah, and just to echo that, yeah, I'm excited to continue the conversation, and thanks so much for having us.
And I just want to close it by saying thank you so much to everybody attended today. Thank you so much to our speakers, but also thank you for being with us throughout both the COVID conversations and the webinars for the Feminist Recovery Plan. It's been a long, tough year, but these have been something that's really been a highlight of my work and getting to meet so many amazing people and have great conversations. So thank you all so much for being part of that.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.